Democracy is at the heart of our society, a system by the people for the people. In the societies of ancient Greece, its generalized interest in politics, as well as great debates in the public square. In our society, it allows us to choose people who represent us, our values, and our interests. We can even run for office and represent the interest of our group ourselves. It is therefore to no surprise that there is a consensus amongst people that democracy is a good political regime, at least for our society. But let's say, hypothetically, that a pandemic of a dangerous virus has just hit us, and a quick decision should be made to avert a national disaster. Wouldn't it be more efficient to give control of the situation to a small group of experts in epidemiology and public health to make the appropriate decisions rather than going through a democratic process that follows public opinion? In that case, a decision made by a governor in the United States or by the parliament in Canada. This situation certainly raises doubts about certain parts of our democratic way of making decisions. Now, this doubt leads me to ask myself a question. Can authoritarianism be preferable to democracy? I believe the answer is yes, though the regime has to be somehow technocratic. We do not want to fall into a situation like the one of the USSR, where Lenin, theorist and leader of the Soviet Union before his death, considered that Stalin had more power than he could manage, and that he could be dangerous if he were his successor. Before he does exactly that, terribly executes the collectivization of farms and persecutes ethnic minorities. It is therefore very important for me to explain my position, to add the necessary nuances to justify it. First, it is important to define some concepts on which I base my position. Democracy is a political system in which sovereignty is in the hands of the citizens. In the case of Quebec, where I live, in the form of a parliamentary representative system, with one elected official per district as our suffrage method. Though it would be nice to have proportional representation with 50 other elected members of parliament, but that is a topic for another time. Authoritarianism is a little more vague concept, but we can guide ourselves towards an acceptable definition. Juan José Linz, one of the first people to make conceptual contributions on the subject, described it as political systems with limited pluralism, politically unaccountable, without elaborate and guiding ideology, but endowed with specific mentalities, without extensive or intensive mobilization, except at certain stages of their development, or occasionally, a small group exercises power within formally ill-defined but in fact rather predictable limits. We can even better define it as a political regime in which sovereignty belongs to a small number of people. It should be noted that this number is not defined. There are several types of authoritarian regimes, just as there are different types of democracies. It is by no means a pejorative term. And the discussion today is about in which context an authoritarian regime can be preferable to democracy in Western society. By authoritarianism may be preferable, I mean specific situations in which our current regime is not effective in terms of fairness, rationality of decisions made, or efficiency. Thus, I believe that there are times when authoritarianism is a mode of operation superior to the democratic process. First of all, in the sense that the general incompetence of parliamentary representatives harms the proper functioning of our society and the well-being of its citizens. Although our elected officials, including our ministers, normally have a lot of knowledge about the institutions in place, sometimes they do not have much experience or are simply not competent enough for their job. For example, the selection of ministers is made amongst the deputies who have been elected, and their competence is not always guaranteed, since their selection is made in consideration of the government towards various aspects of society. In addition to balancing the representation of professional categories and cultures, including parity, which is representation of men and women in parliament. Ministers are often also appointed according to their popularity, and not according to their actual competence. A good example of a flaw in this selection is the case of Stephen Guilbeault, environmental activist and founder of Équiterre, an interest group in favor of environmental change. Stephen was appointed heritage minister even though he had better competence in the field of environmentalism. In the event of a public health crisis, a democratic process based on decisions made by a minister elected by his popularity does not appear to be effective, and may even harm the well-being of the population. A better way of proceeding on the competence of decision makers is already present in Quebec, where I live, in the form of a certain technocracy in the ministry. In other words, a bureaucracy. Senior officials who have years of experience, connections, and extensive knowledge in their field, not having been elected but working in the ministry as a paid work, can influence or even make decisions. Applied as such, it is therefore not a question of a negative concept as a tyranny of egotistical men, but of the sovereignty of a few officials who act in a well-intentioned way, who make rational decisions based on their years of experience and not their desire to keep their place in the National Assembly. These leaders can be replaced if the consensus of their equally capable colleagues so requires. Second, it is important to add that the whole population being subject to public opinion is undesirable when it can ostracize a minority group. For example, the project of the Third Link, a project that was pushed by radio channels to make financial gains, only to be taken over by right-wing populists like the Coalition Avenir Québec, has greatly influenced public opinion, which is generally little sought after by citizens making the commute by Quebec-Lévis every morning. Here the tyranny of the majority could neglect the effects on the local population surrounding the entrance as well as on the farmers who have agricultural land on the territory where the slip road would pass joining the Third Link to Highway 20. It is the only one of many examples, like the segregation of racialized neighborhoods in the United States by freeways, but it illustrates my point very well. The kind of authoritarianism that I have described as being not based on unreasonably grounded public opinion, at least most of the time, is therefore desirable over democracy when making important public decisions. A council of town planners and transport experts would be much better able to find a solution to the congestion problem on bridges than a group of citizens with a biased view of their experience on those bridges and looking for a quick fix, like a Third Link, that would actually worsen their traffic issue, hence themselves voting against their own interests. Then it could be argued that an education system that encourages and mandates political education would create a democratic system without the problems mentioned above. The majority of the population would be able to make rational decisions, so in this case, authoritarianism would never be preferable to democracy. To refute this objection, must first be mentioned that a political education would not solve the problems of today's democracy, for a few reasons. In the first place, political education could always be subject to the predominant ideology in society, like liberalism or conservatism. It would not necessarily empower people to make rational decisions all the time. Some people are naturally reactionary or simply lack the time to educate themselves on everything that comes into the public eye. It is nevertheless similar in the case of representative democracy. The ministers can often be overworked by their dedication to several tasks, such as debates, political combat, elections, which mean that the depth of their analysis of a certain situation is lacking. They can easily ignore some aspect of a situation and slip their ignorance under the radar. In addition, a political education does not cover environmental problems, town planning, and hundreds of other fields in which the citizen or the elected official does not have much knowledge, or at least the knowledge required to make a good decision on the fate of society. Second, even if this problem of democracy were solved, the system would still be subject to some public opinion, including the search for a quick solution to a problem, dogmas, and rhetoric. The list goes on. Political education cannot be expected to make elected officials as competent as civil servants with years of experience and knowledge of the best decisions that are to be made. Thirdly, I think it is important to add that this argument would not even attack the points made above, since it interprets it as authoritarianism being always preferable to democracy, whereas it is not the case. I am arguing for decision-making by well-educated and well-meaning officials for specific problems and situations in which the democratic process is not optimal. I love democracy, but any regime has its limits. Ultimately, while democracy is a desirable system, there are times when it is simply less capable of performing a task than a regime viewed as a technocratic or authoritarian. This brings another point about authoritarian socialism in the global south. Historically, authoritarianism in a socialist context has succeeded in creating results that, despite the restriction of individual freedoms, have improved the quality of life of the population. Think of the Bolshevik regime that overthrew the monarchy to fully industrialize Russia in the space of 20 years. In the case of an improvement in the quality of life, one can justify an authoritarian regime. A study made in 1962 showed that people living in socialist countries enjoyed a higher level of wealth, education, and quality of life compared to capitalist countries within a similar stage of development. Hakim made an entire video about that, which I will link in the description down below, along with the study that was used in the video. One could justify the authoritarianism of Marxism-Leninism by citing this argument. Considering that it was the prevailing ideology of socialist states at the time, it should also be noted that this ideology could be considered much less authoritarian than its predecessor, feudalism. Unlike a horizontal communist structure, which gives the weight to the population to decide directly on the allocation of public goods, authoritarianism reduces the weight on the shoulders of the population. The decision-making pressure is on the shoulder of the sovereign, and not on those of the population. It makes decision-making efficient, as in the case of Vietnam, which made the internet accessible in less than 2 years for most of the population. In developing economies, people can therefore focus their immediate needs instead of spending time debating democratically. With the centralization of power, there is a reduction in the supply of absolutely non-essential products, which increases the production capacity in other sectors. It allows us to move along the production possibility frontier. An authoritarian government can force a shift in production and develop less advantaged sectors, which is usually great for rapidly industrializing a country, which was the goal of Marxist-Leninist regimes. Now, as with anything, there are objections to the points I have made. There are ways to achieve the same goal in a similar context, but democratically. First of all, it might be argued that authoritarianism requires repressive control of the population, including limiting freedom of the press and expression, as well as limiting access to information. This argument seems to attack USSR-style regimes, which have undoubtedly been more repressive than was necessary. Here we are mainly talking about the planning of an economy and the collectivization of the means of production to eliminate poverty and industrialize a developing country. It is clear that the repression of the people is not a likable aspect of authoritarian regimes, and this is not the point I am trying to make. Rather, on which occasions is authoritarianism more effective than a democracy? Then it's arguable that political plurality is important. The people have the right to make decisions about the functioning of their society. Now, I agree with this point. Different groups need different representation in government to avoid ostracism or neglect. But then again, this is not attacking the right arguments, as I do think democracy has its place, though it is not a necessity in the case of a developing country with a poorly educated population that needs rapid industrialization. A similar thing goes for the argument that an authoritarian system is very likely to fail to adapt to changes, and after some time to diverge from the original purpose and to rule only for power. For example, socialism with Chinese characteristics, which has gotten more capitalistic over the years. There needs to be a constitution, institutions in place to regulate the power of the sovereign, until the necessity of a democratic process where the population can make rational choices based on their experience and their education. Having thought about our position, we must now think about the relevance of this question. It is a question for me of justifying critical support for the authoritarian regimes of the Global South and of ensuring that one understands certain political concepts that govern society. Even though I consider myself a Quebec-style democratic socialist, I do critically support Marxist-Leninist regimes like Cuba, Vietnam, and China for their struggle to achieve a socialist society. Of course, there is some repression to it. That's why it's called critical, not blind support. Understanding authoritarianism also prompts us to understand the place of democracy, freedom as a concept, and the importance of the collective good. One needs to know authoritarianism to take a rational stand and either not repeat the mistakes of the past or learn from the successes of political regimes preceding our representative democracy. It's still important to know that the specter of democracy and authoritarianism is not a dichotomy, and it's difficult to put a number on the tendencies of different governments throughout our history. We can also argue that some authoritarianism is good or bad, like the repression of women in Texas. That would be an example of bad authoritarianism, but that is not something I am trying to argue. Either way, it would be beneficial to our society if our citizens were more involved in public debates to build rationally based opinions on the issues that affect them and their neighbors, instead of looking back towards reaction or dogmatic attitudes that plagues our modern democracies. We cannot expect society to function well when its citizens vote against their own interests. Thank you for watching, and again, make sure to express any concerns or rebuttals to my arguments in the comment section below.